Libertarian Chase Oliver attracted national attention in 2022 as a U.S. Senate candidate in Georgia. He even had a one-on-one debate with Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock after Republican challenger Herschel Walker skipped the matchup.
We're right here, and I'm ready to debate him. I'm happy to debate the senator here tonight. If you're going to represent the state of Georgia, you need to be able to show up.
Oliver will again be on ballots this fall, and not just in Georgia. Oliver is the Libertarian nominee for President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are millions of American voters right now who are dissatisfied with the broken two-party system, who see the Trumps, the Bidens, and yes, even the warmed-over Democrat RFKs of the world, and see failure. They see continued lowering of expectations, and we need to provide them a better vision.
But Oliver won't likely be the only candidate sharing the top of the ballot with President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump.
In the final hours of the legislative session, Republicans passed a bill that could make it easier for some third-party candidates to make the ballot. Republican State Senator Max Burns wrote the law.
There was a small section in Senate Bill 189 that would allow candidates for president who are on 20 other state ballots to be on the ballot in Georgia.
And this could be a big deal. Georgia was decided by under 12,000 votes in 2020. If other candidates siphon enough votes from Biden or Trump, it could turn the outcome of the whole race.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas, and this is Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast. So, Rahul, let's start with the legislation that takes effect on July 1st. What would it do exactly?
So, Sam, you've led our coverage on the continuing changes to Georgia's election and voting laws over the past few years. In the most recent state legislative session, almost all the proposals ended up in Senate Bill 189. And during one of the final presentations of the bill, there were 5 lines added that got my attention. It would allow third-party presidential nominees to get their name on the ballot if they're able to qualify on the ballot in 20 other states or territories. You and I were both at the Georgia State Capitol when this was added on the final day. What are we hearing about where this came from?
Well, right, Rahul. I mean, for a couple of days afterwards, we were all scratching our heads trying to figure out where this piece came from, because it had not been part of the discussion that had occurred over the course of the legislative session over some of these measures that ultimately made it into this omnibus bill. What we've been able to kind of figure out is that Republicans say this legislation is in response to a court decision. And that court decision seems to be a ruling in the 2016 case, Green Party of Georgia v. Kemp. Now, that decision was 8 years ago, and Republicans are now codifying ballot access language in 2024. So Democrats fear that this change is actually aimed at making it easier for third-party candidates to get on the ballot who would siphon votes from President Joe Biden. So, Rahul, I want to just map this onto one candidate, for example, basically. Let's say independent Robert F. Kennedy Jr. How would this change affect his ability to access Georgia's ballot, which he has not secured yet?
So here's the frustrating part, Sam, with this being added at the last second. A number of folks involved, including lawyers, are trying to understand the exact wording. And even to this point, I've been getting phone calls and emails trying to explain what's going on. Here's my understanding at this moment. That's the best way for me to say it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would not fall under the 20-state rule that kicks in July 1st because he's not part of a third party. He's just an independent candidate. So he would still be pursuing the current process of gaining ballot access in Georgia, which is 7,500 verified voter signatures. Now, if that changes or the interpretation changes, the Kennedy campaign website says they've collected enough signatures for 16 states for now. Bottom line, my understanding is that Kennedy would have to pursue the 7,500 signatures by July 9th. versus those who are part of existing political parties like the Libertarians or the Green Party.
Okay, though I should add, local election boards still have to verify these signatures, so it doesn't mean that Kennedy is on the ballot in all of those states that he's talking about at this point. But Rahul, just listening to your description just now, it seems like there is still some ambiguity with these new rules themselves. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Again, Sam, my frustration and the frustration of some of the folks that I'm talking to is that there are things missed when you add stuff at the last second. For example, when it comes to this new rule involving 20 states, there doesn't seem to be a clear deadline. In the show open, you heard the voice of Republican State Senator Max Burns, who authored Senate Bill 189, which made a number of those election and voting changes, including that one. I also talked to State Representative John LaHood. He carried the legislation on the House side. And in my last conversation with him, he believes that either the Secretary of State or the Georgia State Election Board will need to set that deadline.
Let's talk about the candidates some more. We started the show with Chase Oliver, the Libertarian nominee. Rahul, what slice of the electorate is he trying to appeal to?
So, Sam, let me start by talking about Chase Oliver. He's a known quantity here in Georgia for a few years. Along with his run for U.S. Senate, he has also run for U.S. House. Before he was a Libertarian, he was an anti-war Democrat and then joined the Libertarian Party back in 2010. He's running on a number of traditional Libertarian issues, including less government spending, less government regulation. But what I've noticed in his case is he has taken a deeper position on a wider range of issues. For example, he supports abortion rights and he supports banning the use of federal dollars for abortion clinics.
And Rahul, Oliver is really young, right? I mean, barely eligible to be president young. That's quite a contrast with the two major party nominees who are both in their 70s and 80s.
That's right, Sam. Chase Oliver is 38 years old, significantly younger than any other candidate. During the debate among the Libertarian presidential candidates at their national convention, Oliver talked about some of the voters he will be targeting.
Most of us became libertarians between the age of 18 and 29, and we've identified that as the population that our campaign is going to target, winning the next generation for liberty, just like all of you got into this party when you were between the ages of 18 and 29. Most of you, that's what we're going to do for these kids out there.
In his pitch to Libertarian convention delegates, Oliver also talked about running a lower cost but high-tech campaign that includes targeted ads. So, Sam, let's circle back to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Well, he is the non-major party candidate polling the highest. He's an environmental lawyer who has also built a following for his anti-vaccine activism in the past. Back in November, he talked about how he sees his path to the presidency with the PBS NewsHour.
All of the traditional battleground states are states that we think we can do really well, and all I need to do.
You're talking Wisconsin, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and all I need to do in those states, Arizona. Michigan, Ohio, Georgia. All I need to do in those states is get 34% of the vote, and I can walk away with 270 electors. So, because the electors are winner take all, and it's assigned by plurality rather than majority.
Which I should point out, I guess, is technically possible, but, is extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely. However, lately I have been seeing RFK volunteers at so many local festivals with clipboards trying to procure signatures to get him on the ballot in Georgia. But even going back to last year, I would talk to voters who expressed curiosity, at least, in RFK. I met Grace Bray and her mom, Tammy Rivenbark, at the Alpharetta Farmers Market back in August.
I do like RFK a lot. I like what he has to say. I like a lot of the things he's passionate about.
I will admit, RFK has been very attractive to me.
Rivenbark said she voted for Trump in 2016, but stayed home in 2020. And now she's considering a vote for RFK.
I don't even know how viable he would be, and I don't want to get sucked back into putting my energy into a broken system.
Sam, it's interesting. I also ran into what we could call a Trump-Kennedy voter. Back in March, the day of Georgia's presidential primary, I spoke with Emily, who didn't share her last name. We met up at a polling location in Alpharetta, and she told me she had voted for Donald Trump on that day and in the past, but that she's leaving the door open to Kennedy if he gets on the ballot.
I am more in line with where Donald Trump is, but I think that I'm so tired of seeing so much division and so much fighting and so much just constant. I think that he would make better decisions for the country, honestly, but like I'm trying to raise kids in this world and it's just exhausting, the fighting, and I think there would still be some controversy if something did happen with RFK, but I think it would just be, I just think that he cares more about bringing people together a little bit, which is why I'm interested in him. I haven't decided.
And I do have to mention something before we move on. It is so interesting that you and I keep running into these different swing voters in North Fulton County. 2 years ago, it was the split ticket Brian Kemp, Raphael Warnock voters. Now we're running into Republicans, specifically Trump voters, who are opening the door to Kennedy. I think that's why we're seeing these increasing attacks on Kennedy by former President Trump.
But, it's not just Republicans who are what I call Kennedy curious.
Yeah, we also have seen pushback on the Democratic side as well. For example, back in April, we saw notable members of the Kennedy family join together and endorse President Biden. And just like former President Trump pointing out Kennedy's positions that may bother conservatives, Biden's team will point out the issues that may bother some more liberal voters.
Finally, Rahul, let's talk about a candidate who could peel off more voters on the left, Jill Stein with the Green Party, who also ran in 2012 and in 2016. Rahul, you recently attended one of Stein's events in Metro Atlanta, and I'm curious what stood out to you.
So, Sam, let me take you over to Cobb County and the Masjid al-Furqan, the West Cobb Islamic Center. The Georgia Muslim Action Committee and other groups put together what they called a voter education town hall, which featured Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein. It was a wide-ranging forum, about 2 hours. And being in a mosque, she did talk about the conflict in Israel and Gaza.
If our president would only stand up and make a phone call with some backbone and insist that Netanyahu, his buddy, cease and desist.
Now, speaking to her after the event, Stein said it would be huge to get on the ballot in Georgia.
It recognizes that there's a diversity of opinion out there now, and people are hungry for other choices, and there they see them. So it will really change the run-up to the election as well, and our coverage by media, and it will change the debate.
Now, this forum did have a second candidate, the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Socialist of America. I talked to Kayana Garcia after the event, and she believes her party is going to be able to collect 7,500 signatures and get on the ballot in Georgia as well.
Okay, so talk to me about the voters you met.
So I talked to Fahim Akbar of Marietta, and he tells me he is open to voting for Stein, but listening to him, you can tell there's much more that's going to what he calls his calculation.
Now that I hear her, it gives a lot of vibrancy for me for this next election. But then the second thing is also what is most likely and what will happen based on that vote, right? What is most likely to happen, and then what are the results that happen based on that decision?
So, Sam, look, there's absolutely voters who are going to go vote or write in the third-party candidate that they support, whether it's Libertarian, Green, Democratic Socialist, or any other that gets on the ballot. But there are going to be people like Fahim who are balancing between different candidates over different issues, and those may be the folks that Biden and Trump have to focus on as well.
Time for a break. This is Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast. Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast.
We've been talking about third-party and independent candidates, and of course, there's a rich history of these runs, from Ralph Nader to Ross Perot.
And don't forget Teddy Roosevelt, who ran on the Bull Moose or Progressive Party ticket after losing his bid for the Republican nomination in the 1912 election. Save that for our next Politics and Pines trivia night.
So, Sam, I want to make sure I write that one down for our next Politics and Pines trivia in October. But, Sam, can you put the 2024 third-party and independent runs into some historical context?
Well, let's talk first about why these bids matter, why we're spending a whole episode talking about them. They matter because Georgia's margin in the 2020 presidential election was just under 12,000 votes. So small. So a few thousand votes here or there to alternative candidates could shape the whole outcome. This also underscores many voters being, unsatisfied with the major party nominees, Biden and Trump. And that actually fits with historical precedent, says Valdosta State University professor Bernard Tamas. Tamas wrote The Demise and Rebirth of American Third Parties and spoke with NPR's Scott Detrow recently.
Well, this is the type of moment where third parties actually tended to have been historically most successful in American politics. There's moments where the two parties become very polarized, where there's this movement away from the center.
Tamas says that successful candidates have deployed what he calls a sting like a bee strategy.
So the idea of sting like a bee is you tap into that anger with some forms of galvanizing issues, something that really energizes them. And you use that to distinguish yourself from the major parties and to attack them and cause them pain. And the idea is to get the major parties to co-opt the issues that the third party candidate is presenting. And so once, like the bee, they sting, they have a tendency then to die. But the goal of actually influencing policy in America is achieved.
So, Sam, do we know whether third-party candidates are going to hurt Biden or Trump more?
Well, people voting for Stein probably helps Trump. These are voters on the left who might have otherwise been inclined to vote for Biden. Maybe Oliver helps Biden by siphoning some Republican-leaning voters for Trump who won't vote for Biden. But, with RFK, it's really less clear. With RFK, Tamas says there is no way to know at this point who he's going to harm more. So it makes sense that both campaigns seem to be alarmed by his candidacy.
Sam, there are so many scenarios, but there is a little bit of history that I've covered here in the state of Georgia. And let's start with the Libertarians. There's always been this strong libertarian streak in Georgia, and some of that dates back to a popular talk show host here in the 90s and the early 2000s, Neil Bortz. But even he would talk about balancing what a vote for Republican versus a vote for Libertarian would do if that means a Democrat would get elected. I think the Trump folks in Georgia are going to worry about Chase Oliver and worry about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And I think, yes, the Biden folks do worry about the Green Party's Jill Stein. And, of course, who else could get on the ballot in Georgia? Because, of course, of the rule changes, maybe the Democratic Socialist or even a Constitution Party candidate. So many names, so many arguments that may have to be made by Trump and Biden folks about trying to keep their voters or possible voters in their camp.
So what happens next here? When will we know who's actually on the ballot and who's not?
So let me give you a couple of key dates on my calendar. First, July 9th, as I mentioned earlier, that's the deadline for turning in 7,500 verified signatures for a third-party presidential candidate who wants to be on the ballot. Also on July 9th, that's the date of the next Georgia State Election Board meeting. You may remember earlier in the show, I had mentioned that there may have to be some clarifications by that board. Then there's September 17th, and there's a reason why I want to mention this date. That is the date military and overseas ballots are supposed to start going out. Really, that's kind of the last day that who's on the ballot and who's not is going to have to be settled. Because of all of these things being said, we have to keep an eye out for legal action and some of this stuff ending up in the courts. And finally, of course, our favorite day, November 5th, Election Day.
That is all the time we have for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. You can get more Georgia politics online at wabe.org/election2024.
Plugged In is a production of the WABE Politics Desk. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Do us a favor, hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. We'll be back next Friday.